From the private journal of Miss Evelyn Carter, recovered from the estate archives of Richmond, Virginia, 1893. I write this now because silence has kept these truths buried long enough. What happened in the spring of 1855 must be known, though it shames me still to recall how long I remained complicit through my own quietness. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was then a young freedwoman of 22 years, educated beyond what most expected of someone born as I was, into bondage, freed by my father's will upon his death when I was but a child. My mother, rest her soul, had taught me letters in secret before the law changed, and I carried that gift like a lamp through dark years. I worked as a seamstress and record keeper at the Ashford estate, a position of relative comfort that I did not take lightly. The estate sat on the eastern edge of Richmond, a sprawling property of white columns and manicured gardens that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Mrs. Lucinda Ashford, the widow who owned it, maintained the house with exacting precision. She was a woman of rigid posture and pale eyes that seemed to calculate the worth of everything they touched. The spring of 1855 brought an unusual event to Richmond, an auction of such peculiar nature that it drew spectators from as far as Charleston and New Orleans. The notices appeared in late March, printed on cream paper with elegant script, a singular offering. April 15th. Reynolds Auction House. I first learned of it while organizing Mrs. Ashford's correspondence. Among her letters was an invitation, and beneath it, a smaller card with a single line, viewing recommended. Item of exceptional quality. Evelyn, Mrs. Ashford called from her sitting room that afternoon. Her voice had a quality like winter air, thin and cutting. You will accompany me to town on the 15th. I require your hand for notes. Yes, ma'am, I replied as was expected. She studied me over the rim of her teacup. You write a fine hand. It is a shame, really, what you might have been in different circumstances. I understood this as the compliment she intended, though it settled in my chest like a stone. The days leading to the 15th were peculiar. Mrs. Ashford received visitors, gentlemen in dark coats who spoke in low tones in her parlor. I was instructed to serve tea but not to linger. Yet I heard fragments, unprecedented, investment, historical significance. One man laughed and said, "If the reports are true, Lucinda, this could change the entire conversation." Change it toward what? I wondered but did not ask. There were rules in the Ashford house, unspoken but absolute. One did not question. One did not presume. One kept one's eyes lowered and one's thoughts private. I had lived by these rules for 7 years, ever since Mrs. Ashford had hired me, and they had kept me safe, fed, sheltered. But on the night of the 14th, I found something that made my hands tremble. I was returning a ledger to Mrs. Ashford's study when I noticed her desk drawer slightly ajar. Inside, partially visible, was a daguerreotype. I should not have looked, but curiosity, that dangerous thing, moved my hand. The image showed a young man, perhaps 25 years of age, standing against a plain backdrop. He was beautiful in a way that seemed almost unreal, features so finely composed they might have been carved from marble. But it was his eyes that held me. Even through the stillness of the photograph, they carried something I could not name. Sorrow, perhaps, or warning. On the back, in Mrs. Ashford's hand, Lot 47, reserve price $12,000. $12,000, a sum beyond imagination. I replaced the daguerreotype with shaking fingers and left the study. That night, I barely slept. Something in those photographed eyes haunted me, as though the young man were trying to speak across the silence of the image. The morning of the 15th dawned gray and heavy, with the promise of rain. "Wear your good dress," Mrs. Ashford instructed. "We represent a certain standard." As our carriage rolled toward town, I watched the familiar streets pass, the market square, the church with its white steeple, the rows of shops and offices. Richmond seemed ordinary that day, unaware that something terrible was unfolding in its very heart. We arrived at Reynolds' auction house at 10:30. The building was grander than I expected, with columns and gaslight chandeliers even in daytime. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco, perfume, and something else, something like fear, though I could not say why I sensed it. Mrs. Ashford took her seat in the third row. I sat behind her, notebook ready, and looked around at the assembled crowd. Wealthy men, mostly, though some women attended as well, fanning themselves despite the cool air. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something extraordinary. At precisely 11 o'clock, the auctioneer took his position. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "thank you for your attendance at this most unusual sale." He gestured toward the side door. "Lot 47. The door opened, and my heart, I swear before God, stopped beating. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. Before we continue, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time right now. We're deeply interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented stories that time tried to erase reach. Continuation of Miss Evelyn Carter's journal, April 1855. He entered the room like a man walking to his own execution, which in a sense he was. The young man from the daguerreotype stood before us in flesh and blood, and the photograph had not lied. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with shoulders that suggested strength despite his lean frame. His skin was the color of polished walnut, and his features held that same impossible symmetry I had seen in the image. He wore simple clothing, white shirt, dark trousers, but carried himself with a dignity that seemed to fill the entire room. His hands were shackled. The auctioneer, Mr. Reynolds, a portly man with mutton chops and a voice like honey over gravel, smiled as though presenting a prized horse. "Gentlemen, ladies, lot 47. Age 26 years. Name Joseph. Literate in English, French, and Latin. Skilled in music, mathematics, and philosophical discourse. Trained in the house of the late Professor Whitmore of Charleston, who, as you know, maintained the most refined standards." Joseph, for now he had a name, stood utterly still, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above our heads, as though he could will himself into disappearance. "The bidding," Reynolds continued, "shall begin at $8,000. A murmur rippled through the crowd. 8,000 was extraordinary for any human chattel, no matter their skills. A man in the front row raised his card. 8,000. 8,500, called another. I glanced at Mrs. Ashford. Her face remained composed, but her gloved fingers tightened on her fan. 9,000, she said, her voice cutting clearly through the room. Several heads turned. A woman bidding was unusual, though not unheard of. The bidding continued. 9,500, 10,000. The numbers climbed with a kind of terrible momentum, each increase marking Joseph's value in a currency that should never have existed. At 11,000, only 3 bidders remained. Mrs. Ashford, a silver-haired gentleman from New Orleans, and a younger man whose eyes held something cruel. 11,500, the cruel-eyed man said, smiling. Mrs. Ashford waited precisely 3 seconds. 12,000. Silence fell. Reynolds looked around the room. $12,000. Do I hear 12,500? The silver-haired gentleman shook his head slowly. The cruel-eyed man hesitated, then lowered his card. Sold, Reynolds announced, bringing down his gavel, to Mrs. Lucinda Ashford of Richmond for $12,000. Applause scattered through the room, polite, appreciative, as though we had witnessed a particularly good horse race rather than the sale of a human soul. I felt ill. Mrs. Ashford rose with satisfaction. Come, Evelyn, we must settle the papers. I followed her to Reynolds's office, a wood-paneled room thick with cigar smoke. The transaction took perhaps 20 minutes, signatures, certificates, the transfer of bank notes I could scarcely believe represented real money. "The item will be delivered to your estate this evening," Reynolds said. "I trust you will find him satisfactory." "I'm certain I shall," Mrs. Ashford replied. Professor Whitmore's reputation was impeccable. As we left the office, I glimpsed Joseph being led through a side corridor by two attendants. For just a moment, his eyes met mine. What I saw there was not anger or despair, but something far more unsettling, a kind of knowing, as though he understood something I did not, something terrible that awaited in the shadows of the Ashford estate. That evening he arrived in a covered wagon. I watched from the upper window as Mrs. Ashford received him in the front hall. Even from that distance, I could hear her voice, sweet as poisoned honey. "Welcome to Ashford Estate, Joseph. You will find that I maintain certain standards. Excellence is expected. Obedience is required. Do we understand each other?" His reply was too quiet for me to hear. "Good," she said. "Evelyn will show you to your quarters. You begin your duties tomorrow." My heart sank. I had not expected this responsibility. I descended the stairs with reluctance. Up close, Joseph was even more striking and more haunted. His eyes, that deep brown that seemed to hold centuries, looked at me with careful blankness. "Follow me, please," I said softly. He did so in silence. I led him to the small room behind the library that Mrs. Ashford had designated. It was clean, sparse. A bed, a washstand, a single window that faced the garden. "You'll take your meals in the kitchen," I explained, adding how my voice sounded complicit, controlled. "Mrs. Ashford rises at 7. She'll expect you in the music room at 8. Joseph nodded once. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "Miss." I looked back. "You keep records here, don't you?" he asked quietly. "Documents, ledgers." "Yes," I said, uncertain why he asked. He studied me for a long moment, and I had the distinct sensation of being measured, evaluated. "Then perhaps you should look at them closely," he said, "particularly the ones from 1848. Before I could ask what he meant, he stepped into the room and closed the door with a soft click. I stood in the hallway, my pulse racing. 1848, 7 years ago. What had happened in 1848? That night I could not sleep. The house felt different, as though Joseph's presence had shifted something in its foundations. Around midnight, I heard music, a piano being played with extraordinary skill, though I knew the music room should have been locked. The melody was beautiful and unbearably sad. In the morning, I asked Mrs. Ashford's housekeeper, old Martha, if she had heard it. She looked at me strangely. "There was no music, child. You must have been dreaming." But I knew what I had heard. And I knew, with a certainty that made my hands cold, that Joseph had been trying to tell me something. Something about this house. Something about 1848. Something that Mrs. Ashford desperately wanted to keep hidden. Miss Evelyn Carter's journal, April through May 1855. The rules began the very next morning. Mrs. Ashford gathered the household staff, myself, Martha the housekeeper, Thomas the groundskeeper, and young William who tended the stables, in the front parlor at dawn. Joseph stood slightly apart, his face carefully neutral. "Joseph will be serving as my personal secretary and companion," Mrs. Ashford announced. "He will manage my correspondence, provide musical entertainment for guests, and assist with certain intellectual pursuits. No one is to disturb him during his working hours. No one is to engage him in conversation beyond what is necessary for household function. And no one," her pale eyes swept across each of us, "is to enter the East Wing without my express permission. Is that understood?" We murmured our assent. The East Wing. I had worked at Ashford Estate for 7 years and had never been forbidden any part of it before. "Evelyn," Mrs. Ashford continued, "you will continue your usual duties. However, I will now require Joseph to manage the household ledgers. You may train him in our particular system over the next week." My stomach tightened. The ledgers were my domain, my security, but I simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Joseph's expression remained unchanged, but I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Apology, perhaps, or warning. The training began that afternoon in the small office adjacent to the library. I spread the ledgers before him, accounts of expenditures, inventories, staff wages, property maintenance. 7 years of carefully recorded numbers. "Mrs. Ashford is very particular," I explained, keeping my voice professional. "Every entry must be dated and initialed. Any discrepancy, no matter how small, must be noted in the margin with explanation." Joseph studied the pages with intense concentration. His fingers traced the columns, and I noticed his hands, long, elegant, but marked with small scars across the knuckles. "These records go back how far?" he asked. "To 1846, when I began. The earlier volumes are stored in the basement archive." "And you've maintained them all, alone?" "Yes." He looked up at me then, and I felt that same sensation of being measured. "You have beautiful penmanship, Miss Carter, and a precise mind. That's rare." I did not know how to respond to such a compliment, so I simply said, "Thank you." "Tell me," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "have you ever noticed anything unusual in these records? Payments that seemed odd, names that appeared and disappeared?" My pulse quickened. "Why do you ask?" Before he could answer, the door opened. Mrs. Ashford stood in the threshold, her face pleasant but her eyes cold. "How is the training progressing?" "Very well, ma'am," I said quickly. "Joseph is a quick study." "Excellent, Joseph. When you've finished here, I need you in the music room. We're expecting guests this evening, and I want you to prepare the chopin." "Yes, ma'am." She lingered a moment longer, her gaze moving between us, then withdrew. Joseph waited until her footsteps faded before speaking again. "She watches everything, doesn't she?" "Always," I whispered. Over the following days, I trained Joseph in the household accounts, and a strange partnership began to form between us. He learned quickly, too quickly, as though he already understood systems of record-keeping and was merely learning Mrs. Ashford's particular preferences. But it was the small moments that unsettled me. Once, while reviewing the 1849 ledger, his finger stopped on an entry. "Payment to Dr. Harrington, March 12th, $150. Medical consultation." "Who was Dr. Harrington?" he asked. "I don't recall," I admitted. "The entry was made before I fully understood Mrs. Ashford's business. She received many consultations." Joseph said nothing, but he copied the name into a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket. Another time, I found him standing before the locked door to the east wing, simply staring at it. "You shouldn't be here," I warned, "if she finds you." "Do you know what's inside?" he interrupted. "No, it's been locked since before my time." "But you're curious." I hesitated. "Yes." He smiled faintly, sadly. "Curiosity is dangerous in places like this, Miss Carter, but necessary." That night I heard the music again, the phantom piano playing in the locked music room. This time, I crept from my bed and moved silently through the dark house until I stood outside the music room door. The melody was the same, beautiful, mournful, impossibly complex. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard something else beneath the music, a voice, Joseph's voice, singing softly in a language I did not recognize. French, perhaps. The words seemed to tell a story of loss and imprisonment, of souls trapped in beautiful cages. The music stopped abruptly. "You can come in, Miss Carter." I froze. How had he known? Slowly, I opened the door. The room was dark except for a single candle burning on the piano. Joseph sat at the keys, his hands resting lightly on the ivory. "You shouldn't be here at night," I said. Mrs. Ashford would. Mrs. Ashford is asleep, he replied. She takes laudanum every evening at 9 o'clock. She will not wake until dawn. How do you know that? Because I pay attention. He gestured to the chair beside the piano. Sit with me, please. Against my better judgment, I did. You asked me about 1848, I said quietly. What happened then? Joseph's fingers touched the keys without pressing them. That's when it started, the pattern. Did you ever wonder why Mrs. Ashford, a widow of means and education, lives alone in this great house? Why she has no family, no close friends, only servants and acquisitions? I assumed she preferred solitude. No, his voice was gentle but firm. She prefers control, and she has a particular taste for beautiful things that can be owned completely, things that cannot leave, cannot speak freely, cannot exist except as reflections of her will. A chill ran down my spine. What are you saying? I'm saying that I am not the first, Miss Carter, and if we are not careful, I will not be the last. Before I could respond, we both heard it, a floorboard creaking in the hallway above. Joseph's hand shot out and extinguished the candle. We sat in sudden darkness, barely breathing. Footsteps crossed the ceiling, slow, deliberate, searching. Mrs. Ashford was awake. Joseph leaned close and whispered directly into my ear. The basement archive, 1848. Look for the name Marcus Whitfield. The footsteps descended the stairs. I fled from the music room through the servants' passage, my heart hammering, and reached my own room just as I heard Mrs. Ashford's voice echo through the house. Joseph, are you awake? His reply was calm, perfectly composed. Yes, ma'am. I couldn't sleep and thought to practice. I hope I didn't disturb you. Not at all. Her voice dripped with false sweetness. But you should rest. Tomorrow will be demanding. Of course, good night, ma'am. I lay in my bed, trembling, as the house settled back into silence. Marcus Whitfield, 1848. What had happened to him? And what did it mean for Joseph, and for all of us now? Miss Evelyn Carter's journal, late May 1855. I waited 3 days before I dared visit the basement archive. 3 days of careful observation, noting Mrs. Ashford's routines, confirming that she attended her Thursday afternoon society meeting without fail, that she took Thomas with her as driver, that the house would be as empty as it ever became. Martha was in the kitchen preparing dinner. William was in the stables. Joseph was presumably in the music room. Mrs. Ashford kept him there most afternoons, practicing for the endless series of gatherings she hosted. I descended the narrow stairs with a candle, my hands unsteady. The basement was cool and smelled of old paper and mildew. Wooden shelves lined the walls, packed with ledgers, correspondence, legal documents dating back decades. The Ashford family had kept meticulous records of everything, every transaction, every acquisition, every triumph and loss. I found the 1848 ledgers on the third shelf. 4 volumes bound in dark leather, their spines cracked with age. I opened the first one, dated January through March. The entries were mundane at first, household expenses, payments to tradesmen. Then, in February, I found it. February 14th, payment to Charleston Auction House. Item, Marcus Whitfield, sum $4,200. My breath caught. Marcus Whitfield, the name Joseph had given me. I turned pages frantically, searching for more references. There, March 5th. Payment to Taylor, clothing for MW $42. April 3rd. Payment to tutor, French and music instruction for MW $20 monthly. The entries continued through the spring and summer, marking Marcus Whitfield's existence in the language of property and expense. Then, abruptly, in September. September 16th, payment to Dr. Harrington, emergency consultation, $150. September 17th, Payment to undertaker, arrangements, $75. September 18th. M.W. interred in family plot. Cause fever. I stared at the words, my hands shaking so badly the candle flame wavered. Fever, a young man purchased at auction, clothed, educated, kept in this house, dead within 7 months. I forced myself to continue searching. The 1849 ledgers yielded another name, David Summerfield, purchased in March for $5,000, dead by December. Cause, complications from influenza. 1851, Thomas Beaumont, purchased in June for $6,800, dead the following January. Cause, respiratory failure. Each one a beautiful young man, each one educated and refined, each one purchased at extraordinary prices, each one dead within months, and each one buried in the Ashford family plot, as though they had been beloved members of the household rather than property. I heard footsteps on the stairs above. Panic seized me. I shoved the ledgers back onto the shelf, but my trembling hands knocked several volumes to the floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire basement. The footsteps quickened. I grabbed my candle and pressed myself into the shadows behind the largest shelf, praying whoever descended would not search thoroughly. Light spilled down the stairs. Evelyn. Joseph's voice, relief and terror warred within me. He appeared at the bottom of the stairs, carrying his own candle. His eyes found me immediately in the shadows. "You found them," he said quietly. "Yes," my voice broke. "Joseph, what is this? What happened to those men?" He moved closer, his expression grave. "What do you think happened?" "The records say fever, influenza, respiratory failure." The records say what she wanted them to say. His voice was hard now, cold. Dr. Harrington was paid very well for his discretion, as was the undertaker. I felt the room tilt. "You're saying she killed them." "I'm saying she broke them, slowly, methodically, until their bodies gave out or their minds did." He set his candle on a shelf, the light casting sharp shadows across his face. "She collects beautiful things, Miss Carter. She adorns them, displays them, controls every aspect of their existence. And when they begin to lose their luster, when they show signs of will or resistance or simple human exhaustion, she discards them." "Why are you telling me this?" I whispered. "Why did you come here?" "Because I needed you to understand, and because I need your help." "My help, Joseph, I'm just—" "You're the record keeper. You're the one who sees the patterns, who maintains the evidence. You have access to everything in this house." He stepped closer, his voice urgent. "Mrs. Ashford made a mistake purchasing me. Professor Whitmore didn't just train me in music and languages. He trained me in law, in history, in the understanding of systems of power." I stared at him. "You're educated." "More than she realizes. Whitmore was complicated. He believed in cultivating our minds even while he owned our bodies. A hypocrite perhaps, but a thorough one." Joseph's jaw tightened. "Before he died, he told me something. He said that slavery had a weakness: documentation, paper trails, records that could be traced, analyzed, used as evidence." "Evidence for what?" "Murder, Miss Carter. 4 men dead under suspicious circumstances, all purchased by the same woman, all dying within months of arrival. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern." My mind raced, but who would listen, who would care? They were. "Property, yes, but Mrs. Ashford made another mistake." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "Professor Whitmore freed me in his will, legally. I have papers." I gasped. "You're free." "Technically, but Whitmore's executor was corrupt. He sold me at auction anyway, pocketed the money, and destroyed the evidence of my manumission, or so he thought." Joseph's smile was bitter. "I kept a copy, hidden in the lining of my coat through the entire process." "Then why didn't you show it immediately? To whom? Reynolds, who profits from such sales, the authorities who benefit from the system. I needed leverage first. I needed evidence that would force someone to listen. He unfolded the document. Even in the candlelight, I could see the official seals, the signatures. This proves I'm free. Combined with evidence of murder, documented, irrefutable evidence, we might actually achieve something. Justice for those men, freedom for me, and safety for you, because if she discovers, you know. The front door slammed upstairs. We both froze. She's back early, I breathed. The meeting was canceled, I forgot. Joseph's face went pale. She told me this morning, Evelyn, you need to get upstairs now. What about you? I'll replace the ledgers, make sure nothing looks disturbed. Go. I grabbed my skirts and ran for the stairs, my heart pounding. I reached the ground floor just as Mrs. Ashford's voice called out. Evelyn, where are you, girl? I forced my breathing to steady. Here, ma'am. I was just checking the linens in the storage room. She appeared in the hallway, still wearing her coat and hat. Her eyes narrowed. You look flushed. It's warm downstairs, ma'am. Close quarters. She studied me for a long moment, too long. Then finally she nodded. I need tea. Bring it to my sitting room. Yes, ma'am. I fled to the kitchen, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the teapot. Martha gave me a concerned look but said nothing. When I delivered the tea, Mrs. Ashford was standing by the window, looking out at the garden. She didn't turn as I entered. Evelyn, you've been with me for 7 years, she said softly. Yes, ma'am. You've always been so reliable, so discreet. I value that immensely. Thank you, ma'am. She turned then, and the look in her eyes made my blood run cold. I would hate to lose that trust. Trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. Do you understand? It wasn't a question, it was a warning. I understand perfectly, ma'am. She smiled. Good, you may go. I left the room on trembling legs. That night Joseph didn't play the piano. The house was silent except for the usual creaks and settling. But around midnight, I found a small piece of paper slipped under my door. In Joseph's elegant handwriting, she knows we've been speaking. Be careful, destroy this note. I burned it in my candle flame and watched the ashes fall. We had crossed a line, Joseph and I. And Mrs. Ashford, with her pale eyes and her perfect control, knew it. The question now was, what would she do about it? Miss Evelyn Carter's journal, June 1855. For 2 weeks, Mrs. Ashford watched us like a hawk observing mice. She assigned tasks that kept Joseph and me deliberately separated. He worked in the music room or accompanied her on calls. I was given endless errands, marketing in town, organizing the attic, cataloging the library. Tasks designed to exhaust and isolate. But she could not watch us every moment. We developed a system of communication born of necessity and risk. Joseph would leave notes tucked inside specific books in the library, always philosophical volumes Mrs. Ashford never touched. Russa, Lucca. I would retrieve them during my cataloging work, read them, destroy them, and leave my responses in the same manner. Through these silent exchanges, we planned. I've been studying the property deeds, Joseph wrote. Ashford estate was purchased in 1846 with funds from her late husband's trust, but there are irregularities in the transfer documents, references to personal assets that funded part of the purchase. I think she's been doing this longer than the records here show. I responded, I can request access to the county records office. Mrs. Ashford sends me there monthly to file property tax documents. No one questions my presence. Perfect. Look for any records associated with her maiden name, Lasunda Hutwall. Also any property transactions in Charleston between 1842 and 1845. The county records office was housed in a brick building near the Capitol, overseen by a weary clerk named Mr. Petson, who barely looked up when I entered. Property records, he asked, already reaching for the appropriate ledger. Yes, sir, but also historical transactions. I'm researching for Mrs. Ushkad's genealogical project. The lie came easily, too easily. He nodded and directed me to the archives room. What I found there made my stomach turn. Lasunda Hutwell, before her marriage, had purchased 3 properties in Charleston between 1842 and 1844. Modest homes, each sold within 18 months of purchase. The pattern was identical: buy property, occupy it briefly, sell at a loss. But attached to each sale record was an estate settlement document. In each case, a young man, described as household servant, had died on the premises. The estates were settled quickly, quietly, with minimal documentation. 3 men, 3 deaths, all before she'd even married Mr. Ushkad. I copied the names carefully: Samuel Brooks, 1842, Peter Whitman, 1843, Isaiah Waters, 1844. When I returned to Ushkad estate that evening, I found Joseph in the garden, ostensibly trimming roses but actually watching for my arrival. "Success?" he asked quietly, his eyes on the house windows. "Beyond what we hoped. She's been doing this for over a decade." His jaw tightened. "Then we have a pattern spanning years and multiple locations. That's significant." "But who would we take this to?" "Joseph, even with your freedom papers, even with evidence." "I know," he set down the shears. "The system protects people like her, but there are cracks in every system. We just have to find them." That night a dinner party was held at Ushkad estate. Mrs. Ushkad often entertained Richmond society, wealthy merchants, minor politicians, ladies of supposed refinement. Joseph was required to perform, playing piano, serving as a curiosity for guests to admire. I watched from the shadows as they praised his musical skill, his refinement, his remarkable education. They spoke about him as though he were an exotic pet. Mrs. Ushkad beamed. "Joseph is quite exceptional, an investment that has proven most rewarding." Investment, the word made me ill. But among the guests that evening was someone unexpected: Judge Harrison Blackwood, recently appointed to the State Circuit Court. He was younger than most judges, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. During the evening, I was serving coffee when I overheard him speaking with Mrs. Ushkad in the corner of the parlor. "Your musician is quite talented," Judge Blackwood remarked. "Where did you acquire him?" "An auction, Runnels House. He came highly recommended from Professor Whatma's estate." "Ah yes, Whatma. I knew him slightly. Brilliant man, complicated politics." The judge's eyes followed Joseph across the room. "He believed in education for all people, didn't he? Unusual view for a man in his position." Mrs. Ushkad's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Unusual indeed." "I understand Whatma freed several of his household in his will. Legal complications ensued." "I wouldn't know about that, Judge. I simply purchased Joseph through proper channels." There was the slightest edge to her voice, a warning. But Judge Blackwood simply nodded. "Of course, proper channels. Still, it's always wise to ensure documentation is thorough. Irregularities can lead to such tedious legal disputes." He said it casually, but I saw Mrs. Ushkad's hand tighten on her fan. After the guests departed, she summoned Joseph to her study. I was in the hallway, supposedly closing windows for the night, but I positioned myself where I could hear. "Did you know Judge Blackwood before tonight?" Mrs. Ushkad asked. "No, ma'am." "Did you have any interaction with him, beyond what I observed?" "No, ma'am." "Joseph," her voice dropped to something cold and dangerous, "I will ask you once more, have you had any contact with anyone regarding your previous circumstances?" A pause, then, "No, ma'am, I would not presume to burden anyone with such matters." The lie was delivered perfectly, calmly. "Good, because if I discovered that you had been indiscreet, I would be very disappointed, and when I'm disappointed I take corrective measures. Do you understand?" Yes, ma'am. You're dismissed. Joseph emerged from the study, his face carefully blank. But as he passed me in the hallway, his hand brushed mine for just a moment. In my palm, he left a folded note. I waited until I was safely in my room to read it. Judge Blackwood knows something. When I played tonight, he requested a specific piece, a Beethoven sonata that Whatma composed arguments to. Scholars use it, legal scholars. He was sending me a message. We may have an ally. Hope bloomed in my chest, fragile and dangerous. But the next morning, that hope was tested. I came downstairs to find Mrs. Ushcad in the front hall with two men I didn't recognize. They wore dark suits and had the look of official authority. "Ovlun," Mrs. Ushcad said sweetly, "these gentlemen are from the city assessor's office. They'll be reviewing our property records. Please provide them with complete access to all ledgers and documentation." My blood went cold. "All of them, ma'am." "All of them. I want to ensure everything is perfectly in order." Her smile was sharp. "One cannot be too careful about documentation, can one?" It was a trap. She knew we'd been in the records. She was forcing me to reveal what we'd seen or to hide evidence, which would itself be suspicious. Joseph appeared in the hallway, returning from an early morning errand. He took in the scene immediately. "Mrs. Ushcad," he said smoothly, "might I assist? I've been managing the current ledgers. Perhaps I could answer the gentleman's questions while Miss Carter gathers the historical volumes." How thoughtful, Joseph. Yes, that would be appropriate. The men followed Joseph to the office. I descended to the basement archive, my mind racing. The ledgers were still there, still contained all the evidence of the dead men. If the assessors looked closely, if they asked questions. I gathered the volumes with shaking hands. But as I lifted the 1848 ledger, something fell from between its pages. A letter yellowed with age, addressed to Mrs. Lasunda Ushcad in a spidery hand. I opened it. "Dear Mrs. Ushcad, per our discussion, I have certified the cause of death as fever. The death certificate has been filed with the county. I trust this settles the matter to your satisfaction. As always." I remained discreet regarding the unfortunate circumstances. "Your servant, Dr. Harrington." It was dated September 18, 1848, the day Marcus Whitfield was buried. Proof, clear, documented proof of complicity. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Quickly, I tucked the letter into my bodice and picked up the ledgers. One of the assessors appeared. "Miss Carter, we're ready for those volumes now." "Of course." I carried them upstairs, my heart hammering against Dr. Harrington's letter. The examination took 3 hours. The assessors reviewed entries, asked perfunctory questions, made notes. Joseph answered everything with perfect composure, his explanations smooth and unremarkable. They found nothing suspicious, or rather they chose to find nothing. Because that was the truth I was beginning to understand. The system didn't want to see. It was built on deliberate blindness. When the assessors finally left, Mrs. Ashford smiled with satisfaction. "There, all perfectly in order. I do like when things are properly documented." That evening, I slipped the letter to Joseph during dinner service. He read it in the servants' passage, his face illuminated by candlelight. When he finished, he looked up at me with something like awe. "This is it," he whispered. "This is proof of conspiracy, if we can get this to Judge Blackwood. How she watches everything now. Then we'll have to be very, very careful." Over the next week, we prepared. Joseph drafted a formal petition detailing the pattern of deaths, the fraudulent sale of his person despite his legal freedom, and Dr. Harrington's complicity. I made careful copies of the most damning ledger entries, working late at night when the house slept. The plan was simple but dangerous. During Mrs. Ashford's next society meeting, Joseph would claim illness. I would deliver our documentation to Judge Blackwood's chambers under the pretense of running an errand for Mrs. Ashford. If it worked, we would force an investigation. If it failed, we would both suffer consequences I couldn't bear to imagine. On the chosen day, Joseph complained of headache. Mrs. Ashford, irritated but not suspicious, left him behind when she departed for her Thursday engagement. I waited 30 minutes, then gathered our packet of documents, wrapped them in brown paper, and left through the kitchen door. Martha stopped me. "Where are you going, child?" "Errand for Mrs. Ashford," I lied. She studied me with those ancient eyes that seemed to see everything. Then, slowly, she nodded. "You be careful now. Some roads are dangerous." "I will." Judge Blackwood's chambers were in the courthouse, a 20-minute walk. Every step felt like walking toward either salvation or destruction. His clerk, a severe woman with spectacles, looked up as I entered. "Yes. I have a petition for Judge Blackwood. It's a legal matter requiring his immediate attention." "The judge is very busy. You'll need to." "It concerns Professor Whitmore's will," I said firmly, "and fraudulent property transactions. I believe he'll want to see it." Something in my voice must have convinced her. She took the packet and disappeared into the inner office. 5 minutes passed, 10. Then Judge Blackwood himself emerged. "Come in, Miss Carter, Evelyn Carter." I followed him into his chambers, a book-lined room that smelled of leather and pipe tobacco. He gestured to a chair and opened our petition. He read in silence for a long time, so long that I began to fear he would simply dismiss everything, call me a liar, send me away. Finally, he looked up. "This is a serious accusation." "Yes, sir. If proven false, you and Mr. Joseph could face severe consequences." "I understand, sir, but it's true, every word." He studied me carefully. "Why bring this to me?" "Because you mentioned documentation, because you knew Professor Whitmore, because," I took a breath, "because I believe you care about truth." Judge Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll need to examine the original documents, and I'll need testimony from Dr. Harrington." "Dr. Harrington is complicit." "Then he'll have the opportunity to explain himself under oath." The judge's expression was grave. "Miss Carter, what you're asking for is an investigation into a respected member of Richmond society. Such things do not proceed quickly or quietly." "I understand." "Do you? Because if Mrs. Ashford learns of this before I can act, you and Joseph will be in considerable danger." My hands were shaking. "We already are, sir." He nodded slowly. "Then I'll move as quickly as the law allows. Can you return with the original documents tomorrow?" "Yes, sir." "Come at noon, and Miss Carter," his eyes were kind but serious, "be very, very careful." I returned to Ashford Estate just before Mrs. Ashford arrived home. Joseph met my eyes across the hallway, asking a silent question. I nodded once. It was done. We had set forces in motion that could not be stopped. Now we could only wait and pray, and hope that justice moved faster than vengeance. Miss Evelyn Carter's journal, late June 1855. The waiting was agony. Judge Blackwood had promised discretion, but we both knew that investigations, once begun, sent ripples through communities like Richmond. Someone would notice, someone would talk, and Mrs. Ashford had eyes and ears everywhere. For 3 days, the house maintained its surface calm, while tension coiled beneath like a spring wound too tight. Then, on the 4th day, Dr. Harrington came to call. I was in the parlor polishing silver when his carriage arrived. Through the window, I watched him descend, an elderly man with white whiskers and a black bag, walking with the stiff gait of someone carrying heavy secrets. Mrs. Ashford received him in her study with the door closed, but voices carry in old houses, and if one pressed one's ear to certain walls. This is highly irregular, Lucinda. Dr. Harrington's voice was strained. Judge Blackwood's clerk visited me yesterday, asked questions about past consultations, about death certificates I'd signed. What did you tell him? Nothing. I cited physician confidentiality, but he was persistent. He mentioned specific dates, specific names. A long silence. Then Mrs. Ashford, her voice like ice. Someone has been talking. Or someone has been reading documents they shouldn't have access to. The ledgers are secure. Are they? Are you certain, Lucinda? Because I destroyed my own records years ago as you requested, which means the only evidence linking me to those unfortunate situations exists in your records. Are you suggesting I've been careless? I'm suggesting that someone in this household has betrayed your trust, and if the judge proceeds with a formal inquiry, we could both face very serious consequences. Another silence. Then Mrs. Ashford's voice, so cold it made my blood freeze. I will handle my household. You handle the judge. Remind him of his social position, his political aspirations, the considerable donations our circles make to certain campaigns. Lucinda, if there's evidence. There will be no evidence. I'll see to it personally. When Dr. Harrington left, he looked somehow smaller, as though the meeting had diminished him. That evening, Mrs. Ashford summoned both Joseph and me to her study. We stood before her desk while she regarded us with those pale, calculating eyes. The silence stretched until my nerves felt ready to snap. There has been a betrayal in this house, she said finally. I don't yet know its full extent, but I will discover it, and when I do, the consequences will be severe. She looked at me first. Evelyn, you've managed my records for 7 years. Have you noticed anything unusual, any documents missing or misplaced? No, ma'am. The lie tasted like ash. Have you discussed household matters with anyone outside this estate? No, ma'am. Her gaze shifted to Joseph. And you, have you had contact with anyone regarding your circumstances? No, ma'am. She stood and walked slowly around the desk until she stood directly before him. You're lying. Joseph's face remained calm. I have no reason to lie, ma'am. Don't you? Her voice dropped to a whisper. Did you think I wouldn't notice? The looks between you, the way you've been studying my records with such care, the subtle questions about past household members. My heart hammered. You're educated, Joseph. More educated than I initially realized. That was my mistake, allowing Professor Whitmore to cultivate your mind so thoroughly. Intelligence in property is useful, but only when properly contained. When it begins to question, to analyze, to plan. She smiled coldly. That becomes dangerous. I've done nothing but serve you faithfully, ma'am. Faithfully? She laughed, a brittle sound. Is it faithful to conspire? To share confidences with household staff, to perhaps communicate with certain legal authorities? Neither of us answered. She returned to her desk and withdrew a small key from her pocket. I'm implementing new household rules, effective immediately. Joseph, you will no longer have access to the ledgers or correspondence. Your duties will be limited to musical performance and attending me during social events. Evelyn, you will surrender all ledgers to me for safekeeping. I'll maintain them myself from now on. But ma'am, I started. That's final. Additionally, neither of you is to leave the grounds without my explicit permission and accompaniment. All outside errands will be handled by Thomas or Martha. Am I understood? Yes, ma'am, we said in unison. Good, you're dismissed. We left the study, our eyes not meeting, knowing she was watching for any sign of communication between us. That night I couldn't sleep. We were trapped. The evidence we'd gathered was with Judge Blackwood, but if Mrs. Ashford prevented us from providing the original documents, if she destroyed the ledgers, if she somehow influenced the judge to drop the inquiry. Around midnight, I heard a soft tap on my door. Joseph stood in the hallway, his face grave. We need to talk. The library, 5 minutes. He disappeared before I could respond. I wrapped a shawl around my nightdress and crept through the dark house to the library. Joseph was there, standing by the window, watching the grounds. "She's going to destroy the evidence," he said without preamble. "Tonight, tomorrow, soon. I heard her tell Thomas to prepare the furnace. She claimed she wanted to burn old papers, but—" "The ledgers," I breathed. "We have to act now, before she does." "How?" "She's locked everything in her study." Joseph turned to me, and in his eyes I saw something I'd never seen before: cold determination. "I know where she keeps the study key. She wears it on a chain around her neck, but she removes it before bed, puts it in the small box on her vanity." "You want to steal it, Joseph, if she wakes." "I know the risks, but we're out of options." He moved closer. "The original documents must reach Judge Blackwood by tomorrow afternoon. He's convening a preliminary hearing. Without physical evidence, the whole case collapses." My mind raced. "Even if we get the ledgers, how do we get them to the courthouse? She said we can't leave the grounds." "You can't, but I can." His jaw set. "I still have my freedom papers hidden in my room. If I'm stopped, I show those. Legally, I'm a free man. The worst they can do is return me here, and by then the documents will be in the judge's hands. She'll know it was us." "Yes, which is why, after I deliver the documents, I'm not coming back." My heart clenched. "What?" "Evelyn, think. Once the investigation is public, Mrs. Ashford will be desperate, cornered. People like her become most dangerous when they feel control slipping. I can't stay here and wait to become another body in the family plot." "What about me?" He took my hands. "You have to stay. You're her employee, not her property. She can't hurt you without raising questions. And someone needs to be here to testify when the hearing happens, to confirm the documents are authentic." Tears burned my eyes. "This is suicide if something goes wrong." "Then at least I'll die free, not in a cage." His voice softened. "But I don't intend to die. I intend to see her answer for what she's done. All of them, Marcus, David, Thomas, all the others whose names we don't even know. They deserve justice." He was right. I knew he was right. "When?" I whispered. "Tonight, 3 o'clock, when sleep is deepest. I'll need you to keep watch while I get the key." We spent the next hours preparing. Joseph packed a small bag with his freedom papers, copies of the most damning evidence, and a change of clothes. I rehearsed what I would say to Mrs. Ashford when she discovered his absence, how I would claim ignorance, surprise, betrayal. At 3 o'clock, we crept through the silent house. Mrs. Ashford's bedroom was on the second floor, down the hall from mine. I positioned myself at the stairs while Joseph approached her door. He moved like shadow, utterly silent. The door opened without sound. He slipped inside. I counted my heartbeats, 20, 40, 60. A floorboard creaked. I froze. But Mrs. Ashford's breathing continued, steady and deep. The laudanum was working. Joseph emerged carrying a small brass key. His face was pale but triumphant. We descended to her study. The key turned in the lock with a soft click. Inside, the ledgers were exactly where we'd left them, but also stacked on the desk was a pile of documents clearly prepared for burning. Death certificates, Dr. Harrington's correspondence, property deeds. "She was going to destroy it all," Joseph whispered. "Tomorrow, probably." We gathered everything, ledgers, letters, certificates, and packed them carefully in a leather satchel. The evidence of 13 years of murder, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. We were almost to the back door when we heard it. Footsteps upstairs, moving toward the stairs. Mrs. Ashford was awake. "Go," I hissed, "now." Joseph hesitated only a moment, then pressed something into my hand, his mother's ring, a simple silver band. "So you know I'll come back for you." Then he was gone, slipping out into the pre-dawn darkness. I shoved the ring into my pocket and ran to the kitchen. grabbed a glass of water, and was climbing the stairs just as Mrs. Ashford appeared at the top, wrapped in her dressing gown. "Evelyn, what are you doing awake?" "Couldn't sleep, ma'am. Got some water." I held up the glass, praying she couldn't see how my hand shook. She frowned. "I thought I heard something downstairs." "Probably Thomas, ma'am. He rises early to tend the horses." She stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps go back to bed." "Yes, ma'am." I returned to my room, climbed into bed fully clothed, and lay trembling in the darkness. Joseph was out there somewhere, carrying evidence that could destroy a wealthy white woman. A black man alone at night in Virginia. If he was stopped by patrollers, if he was questioned, if he couldn't convince them of his freedom. I clutched his mother's ring and prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. Dawn came slowly. At 7 o'clock, Martha knocked on my door. "Miss Evelyn, Mrs. Ashford wants to see you. She seems agitated." I found her in the study, standing before her open desk, her face white with fury. "Where is he?" she hissed. "Ma'am." "Joseph, he's gone. His room is empty. And my ledgers, my documents." Her voice rose to something near hysteria. "Everything is gone." I made my face shocked. "Gone, but how?" "You know something, you must." "Ma'am, I swear I don't." She crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed my wrist with shocking strength. "Don't lie to me, girl. You've been conspiring with him. I know you have." "Mrs. Ashford, please, you're hurting me." "I'll do more than hurt you if you don't tell me where he's gone." The mask had finally fallen. This was the woman who'd killed 6 men. This was the monster beneath the refinement. But before she could do more, there was a knock at the front door. We both froze. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. Mrs. Ashford released my wrist and straightened her dress, composing herself with visible effort. "Answer it," she commanded. I went to the door on shaking legs. Judge Blackwood stood on the threshold, flanked by 2 court officers. "Miss Carter," he said gravely, "I'm here to see Mrs. Ashford, official business." Mrs. Ashford appeared behind me, her face pale but controlled. "Judge Blackwood, this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is. Mrs. Ashford, I have questions regarding certain death certificates filed between 1848 and 1854. I'd like you to accompany me to my chambers." "I'm afraid that's quite impossible. I'm indisposed." "It wasn't a request, ma'am." His voice was firm but polite. "I have testimony and documentation suggesting serious irregularities. You have the right to respond to these allegations, but you will do so formally under oath." Her hands clenched. "What allegations? Who has been spreading lies?" "That will be addressed at the hearing. For now, I need you to come with me." She looked at me then, and the hatred in her eyes was absolute. But she had no choice. She gathered her shawl and bonnet with rigid dignity and followed Judge Blackwood to his carriage. As they pulled away, I saw her looking back at the house, her beautiful cage, her kingdom of control, and I knew she understood. Her power was ending. And Joseph, wherever he was, had made it happen. Miss Evelyn Carter's Journal, July 1855. The hearing was held on the 7th of July in the Circuit Courthouse, a columned building that seemed designed to intimidate. I arrived at 9 o'clock, wearing my best dress and carrying what little courage I could muster. The hearing room was already crowded. Richmond society had turned out in force, not to support Mrs. Ashford, I realized, but to witness her downfall. There's nothing people love more than seeing the mighty humbled. Mrs. Ashford sat at the defendant's table with her attorney, Mr. Clarence Whitfield, a portly man with a reputation for defending the indefensible. She was dressed entirely in black, like a widow mourning her own imminent destruction. When her eyes found me across the room, they were cold as January ice. Joseph sat in the witness section, flanked by 2 court officers. He wore a simple but dignified suit, and when he saw me, he gave the smallest nod. He was alive. He'd made it. Judge Blackwood entered, and the room rose. "This is a preliminary hearing," he announced, "to examine evidence regarding suspected fraudulent death certificates and possible criminal negligence in the deaths of 6 men between 1842 and 1854. Mrs. Lucinda Ashford stands accused. We will hear testimony and examine documentation." Mr. Whitfield stood immediately. "Your Honor, these accusations are preposterous. Mrs. Ashford is a respected member of this community. She's being slandered by property that she legally purchased and that has since absconded with her personal records." "Mr. Whitfield," Judge Blackwood's voice was ice, "if you refer to Mr. Joseph as property again, I will hold you in contempt. He carries documented proof of manumission from Professor Whitmore's estate. He is a free man, and you will address him with appropriate respect." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mr. Whitfield's face reddened. "Nevertheless, Your Honor, the source of these allegations is questionable at best. The allegations are supported by physical evidence, death certificates, ledger entries, correspondence, all of which we will examine." Judge Blackwood gestured. "Call the first witness." The bailiff announced, "Dr. Raymond Harrington." The old doctor shuffled forward, looking diminished and frightened. After being sworn in, he sat in the witness chair, his hands trembling. Judge Blackwood's questioning was methodical and devastating. "Dr. Harrington, did you provide medical consultation to Mrs. Ashford in September of 1848 regarding a young man named Marcus Whitfield?" I don't recall." "Let me refresh your memory." The judge held up a letter. "This is your correspondence to Mrs. Ashford, dated September 18, 1848. Would you like me to read it aloud?" Dr. Harrington's face crumbled. "Yes, I treated Mr. Whitfield." "What was the cause of death you certified?" "Fever." "Was that accurate?" A long silence. The young man was quite ill. "Dr. Harrington, I'll ask again. Was fever the actual cause of death?" The old man's voice broke. He was severely malnourished. There were signs of physical trauma, bruising consistent with restraint. But Mrs. Ashford insisted that fever be listed. She paid me $150 for my discretion. The courtroom erupted. Judge Blackwood gavelled for order. "And the other cases?" the judge pressed. "David Summerfield, 1849. Thomas Beaumont, 1851. 3 others before Mrs. Ashford moved to Richmond. Did you falsify those death certificates as well?" "Only the Richmond cases, but I'd heard rumors about Charleston, other doctors who'd been similarly compensated." Mrs. Ashford's face had gone white as chalk. "Your Honor," Mr. Whitfield objected, "this is hearsay." "It's sworn testimony. Sit down, Mr. Whitfield." The judge called me next. I walked to the witness chair on trembling legs, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. "Miss Carter," Judge Blackwood began gently, "you worked for Mrs. Ashford for 7 years as a record keeper. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "During that time, did you maintain ledgers documenting household expenses?" "Yes, sir." "Including expenses related to the purchase and maintenance of household staff?" "Yes, sir." He held up one of the ledgers. "Is this your handwriting?" I examined it. "Yes, sir." "Please read the entries for September 1848. My voice shook, but I read them clearly. The payments for Marcus Whitfield's clothing, his education, Dr. Harrington's consultation, the undertaker's fee. Each entry a piece of evidence in a pattern of murder. And these entries were made contemporaneously, as events occurred. "Yes, sir." Mrs. Ashford insisted on meticulous records. "Did she ever ask you to falsify entries or omit information?" I hesitated. This was the moment. Once I spoke, there was no going back. "No, sir. She wanted accurate records. I believe she thought they would never be examined, that her position protected her. Mrs. Ashford half rose from her chair. This is outrageous. That girl has been stealing from me, conspiring with. Mrs. Ashford, you will have your turn to speak, Judge Blackwood said firmly. Sit down. She sat, but her eyes burned with fury. The judge called Joseph next. He walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity, and I saw something remarkable happen. The white people in that courtroom who would normally have dismissed him as property or threat actually looked at him. Really looked. Saw his intelligence, his composure, his humanity. Mr. Joseph, Judge Blackwood began, please state your full name for the record. Joseph Marcus Freeman, Your Honor. Freeman was Professor Whitmore's surname. He granted me the use of it when he freed me. And you have documentation of this manumission? Yes, sir. Joseph produced the papers. They were examined and entered into evidence. Tell us about your purchase by Mrs. Ashford. Joseph's testimony was clear and devastating. He described the auction, Mrs. Ashford's obsessive control, the gradual realization that he was not the first. He spoke of finding references to previous men in the house, of connecting patterns, of understanding that each had been acquired, displayed, controlled, and discarded when they showed signs of independent will. She collects beautiful things, he said quietly, but beauty that maintains its own spirit, its own dignity, becomes threatening to her. She must break it, reduce it to pure possession. When that proves impossible, when the human being refuses to become merely decorative, she eliminates the problem. That's a lie, Mrs. Ashford shouted. I gave those men comfort, education, refinement they never would have known otherwise. You gave them gilded cages, Joseph replied, looking directly at her. And when they outgrew those cages, you killed them. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Blackwood called Mrs. Ashford to testify. She walked to the stand with her head high, every inch the affronted aristocrat. After being sworn in, she sat with rigid posture and folded hands. Mrs. Ashford, the judge began, can you explain the pattern of deaths among young men in your household? They were unfortunate illnesses, tragedies certainly, but not uncommon. Fever, influenza, these things happen. 6 deaths in 13 years, all young men, all purchased at extraordinary prices, all dying within months of arrival. You don't find this pattern suspicious? I find it tragic, nothing more. And the payments to Dr. Harrington, the falsified death certificates. I know nothing of any falsification. Dr. Harrington was my physician. I paid him for his services. $150 for a house call. That seems excessive. He was an excellent doctor, worth every penny. The judge's expression hardened. Mrs. Ashford, I have 6 death certificates, each listing different causes but all showing the same pattern of malnutrition and trauma. I have testimony from Dr. Harrington confirming falsification. I have ledgers showing a pattern of acquisition and disposal. I have testimony from witnesses describing your controlling behavior. What explanation can you offer? She lifted her chin. I can offer the truth, Your Honor. I'm a widow of means who has been targeted by ungrateful servants and a runaway slave spreading malicious lies. Mr. Joseph stole my property and has invented this fantastical story to justify his theft. Miss Carter conspired with him, perhaps seduced by his charms. Dr. Harrington is a senile old man whose memory cannot be trusted. This is a conspiracy, nothing more. A conspiracy documented in your own ledgers, written in your own employee's hand. Ledgers can be altered, records can be fabricated. By whom? Miss Carter, who has worked faithfully for 7 years. Dr. Harrington, who has more to lose than gain from this testimony. Mrs. Ashford's composure finally cracked. You don't understand. They were nothing before I found them. Street vendors, auction house trash property. I elevated them, gave them culture, refinement, purpose. And how did they repay me? With ingratitude, with willfulness, with this. this rebellion of spirit that made them useless for civilized company. The courtroom went absolutely still. "So you admit," Judge Blackwood said slowly, "that when these men showed signs of independent thought you found them problematic." "I admit they were disappointments, poor investments." "And what did you do with these poor investments, Mrs. Ashford?" She realized her mistake too late. They took ill. "Because you starved them, beat them, restrained them until their bodies gave out. I disciplined them, as was my right." "To death, Mrs. Ashford. Was it your right to discipline them to death?" She stood suddenly, her face twisted with rage. "They were mine, legally purchased. I could do with them what I pleased." And there it was, the monster fully revealed. "Except," Judge Blackwood said quietly, "Mr. Joseph was not legally yours. He was a free man fraudulently sold. Which means everything that followed, his imprisonment, his treatment, his intended fate, constitutes kidnapping and attempted murder of a free citizen." Mrs. Ashford's face went from red to white. "And if we examine the Charleston cases more closely, I suspect we'll find similar irregularities. Men who were freed or whose sales were legally questionable, but who ended up in your possession anyway, only to die under mysterious circumstances." The judge stood. "Mrs. Ashford, I am remanding you to custody pending a full criminal trial on charges of fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder. Bail is denied." The courtroom erupted. Mrs. Ashford screamed something, but her words were lost in the chaos. 2 officers moved to restrain her as she fought, all dignity abandoned. As they led her away, she locked eyes with me one final time. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "All of you, I'll see you destroyed." But the doors closed and she was gone. Judge Blackwood gavelled for order. When the room quieted, he spoke. "This court is adjourned. A formal trial will be scheduled within the month. In the meantime, I'm ordering a full investigation into all deaths associated with Mrs. Ashford's household, going back 20 years. We will find the truth, all of it." People began filing out, talking in excited whispers. I sat in my chair, unable to move, barely able to believe it was over. Joseph appeared beside me. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it." He held out his hand. The first time he'd ever offered such a gesture openly, freely, without fear of observation or punishment. I took it. Outside the courthouse, the July sun was bright and warm. For the first time in months, the world felt like it might be a place where justice was possible, where truth mattered, where the powerful could be held accountable. It was a fragile hope, I knew. The world remained what it was, cruel, unjust, built on systems designed to protect people like Mrs. Ashford. But for today, in this moment, we had won. And 6 dead men had finally been given voices. Final entry from Miss Evelyn Carter's journal, September 1855. The trial lasted 2 weeks in August, through heat so oppressive that ladies fanned themselves constantly and men loosened their collars. Richmond society attended every day, transforming tragedy into spectacle, but I suppose that was fitting. Mrs. Ashford had always loved an audience. The prosecution built its case methodically. The ledgers, the death certificates, Dr. Harrington's testimony, accounts from Charleston residents who remembered the earlier cases. They exhumed bodies from the Ashford family plot and found evidence exactly as Joseph had predicted: malnutrition, old fractures, signs of systematic abuse. Mrs. Ashford's defense tried everything. They claimed the evidence was fabricated. They suggested the deaths were coincidental. They argued that even if impropriety occurred, it fell within the bounds of lawful property management at the time. But they couldn't explain the falsified death certificates. They couldn't explain the pattern. And they couldn't overcome the image of Mrs. Ashford's own courtroom confession, witnessed by dozens, recorded by court stenographers. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 20 years imprisonment, a shockingly harsh sentence for a white woman of her status, but the evidence had been overwhelming. The cruelty had been undeniable. I watched as they led her away for the final time. She walked with her head high, refusing to show weakness even at the end. But when she passed me in the aisle, she leaned close and whispered, "You destroyed me for nothing. The world will forget those men in a month, but my name will be remembered." Perhaps she was right. Perhaps cruelty does leave a longer shadow than kindness. But I like to think she was wrong about the forgetting. After the trial, Judge Blackwood helped Joseph establish his legal freedom beyond any question. The fraudulent sale was voided. Professor Whitmore's will was enforced. Joseph Marcus Freeman became, in every legal sense, his own man. He left Richmond in September, traveling north to Philadelphia, where he'd been offered a position teaching music at a freedmen's school. Before he departed, he came to see me one last time. We met in the garden of what had been Ashford Estate, now seized by the state and scheduled for auction. The roses Mrs. Ashford had cultivated so carefully were beginning to wilt from neglect. "Come with me," Joseph said. "To Philadelphia you have skills, education, there are opportunities there." I was tempted, God knows I was tempted. But I shook my head. My mother is buried here, and there's work to be done still. Those 6 men have families, some of them. Someone needs to find them, tell them what happened, give them some measure of peace. Joseph understood. "You'll write to me." "Every month," I promised. He pressed something into my hand, a small leather journal, its pages blank. "For the story, so it doesn't get forgotten." And so I wrote it all down exactly as it happened. The horror and the hope, the cruelty and the courage, the pattern of beautiful men collected, controlled, and destroyed by someone who mistook possession for love. I found 3 families, mothers, siblings, people who'd spent years wondering what happened to sons and brothers who'd simply disappeared into the machinery of slavery and never emerged. I gave them what closure I could, the truth, and the knowledge that justice, however belated, had been served. Dr. Harrington died 6 months after the trial. Heart failure, the papers said, but I think it was shame that killed him. Some men can't live with the weight of their own complicity. The Ashford estate was indeed auctioned. A merchant family from Baltimore purchased it, tore down the east wing entirely, and converted the property into a boarding school for young women. They say the girls sometimes hear piano music at night, sad and beautiful and impossibly skilled. But when they investigate, the music room is always empty. I like to think it's Marcus Whitfield, finally playing without permission or restraint. As for me, I continued working as a record keeper, eventually finding employment with Judge Blackwood's court. My penmanship and precision proved valuable in documenting trials, preserving testimony, maintaining the evidence that holds powerful people accountable. It's modest work, quiet work, but it matters. Because records are how we remember. They're how we bear witness. They're how we prevent the powerful from erasing the truths they find inconvenient. Mrs. Ashford died in prison in 1862, 7 years into her sentence. The Civil War was underway by then, and her death barely registered in newspapers consumed with larger horrors. No one attended her funeral. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. Some would say she got off easy, 20 years for 6 murders, 7 years actually served. But I think about her in that prison cell, stripped of beauty and control and the refined cage she'd built around herself. I think about her forced to live by others' rules, subject to others' power, unable to possess or display or destroy. Perhaps that was the harshest punishment possible for someone like her. This journal, which began as a record of horror, ends as a testimony of survival. Not just Joseph's and mine, but of all those who lived and died under systems designed to reduce human beings to property. Some, like Joseph, found freedom. Others, like Marcus and David and Thomas and Isaiah and Peter and Samuel, found only early graves. But they existed, they lived, they mattered. And now, because these words have been preserved, they will be remembered. That is how we fight erasure. That is how we honor the dead. That is how we ensure that beauty, true beauty, the beauty of human dignity and spirit, survives even the most determined efforts to cage and destroy it. Written this 27th day of September, 1855, Richmond, Virginia, by Evelyn Grace Carter, free woman and witness. This chronicle was discovered in the archives of the Richmond Circuit Court in 1932, filed among records of cases from the 1850s. Miss Carter's journal and supporting documentation were preserved as evidence in Commonwealth v. Ashford, though the case itself had been largely forgotten by local historians until its rediscovery. The journal has since been authenticated and is maintained by the Virginia Historical Society as testimony to both the horrors of the era and the courage of those who fought against them.